We'll introduce ourselves. Devika.
Hi, my name is Devika and I'm the associate researcher on the project We Are Our History, specifically the Bodleian and Empire strand of it.
And I'm Alex Franklin, and I manage the Bodleian Center for the Study of the Book, and I'm leading on this one strand, one of 8 strands in this project, We Are Our History, which is a 2-year Mellon Foundation funded project aiming at increasing racial equity in the Bodleian libraries. A really tall order, a big task. And the strand that Devika and I have been working on is specifically retrospective. It's looking at the history of the Bodleian through the lens of empire and colonialism. We're only representing, really, a massive amount of work that's been done by colleagues in the library before us, and also in recent projects, collaborations with researchers. So we actually have a picture here of Christian Frederick Cole, a caricature of Christian Frederick Cole, representing an earlier collaboration we did with researcher Pamela Roberts, who's the author of Black Oxford, Untold Stories. A lot of research that she has done on Oxford alums and students. And then more recently there's been the display that some of you might have seen a couple of years ago, These Things Matter, a collaboration with Museum of Color, an arts organization, which brought in artists to respond to items in the archives. And tomorrow you will be able to join in an event celebrating another collaboration with researcher Peter Brathwaite, who found his ancestors in archives held in the Bodleian, which detail work on plantations in Barbados. And the story of that you can hear more about tomorrow, and we have bookmarks here representing Peter's concept of mischief in the archives. The Bodleian holds records detailing lives and events in Britain's colonies is of interest to all of us as readers, and especially to researchers seeking those histories. But today, Devika and I are going to present on aspects of the Bodleian's own involvement in the history of empire and colonialism, which may have implications for any of the collections that you are all studying, whether you imagine those are connected with colonies or not. I'm going to start over at this end of the table, and we're going to make a sweep along the table, just touching on a few of these themes. The first one is provenance, something that librarians and people who work with manuscripts and archives and books talk a lot about. Provenance of the collections that are held in the Bodleian, but also the provenance of money that went to build the Bodleian. And the first items here are a couple of documents from the Radcliffe Trust archive. And these, if you read them carefully, indicate that Dr. John Radcliffe didn't make his money only by his physician skills. He was also an investor in the South Sea Company, which was a slave trading company. And in fact, in Parliament, when he was in Parliament, he did everything he could to boost that company and ensure that it had the ability to trade slaves. And he also invested in ships trading with the Americas and the East Indies. Another provenance story coming along, just an indication of some of the effort that's gone into talking about collections in the Bodleian. This is part of the incunable catalogue, the catalogue of pre-1500 printed books in the Bodleian, and specifically this is part of the catalogue that deals with block books. And among a wealth of other detail about these items is a detail of the provenance, who owned the block book before the Bodleian. I put the digital picture of this this block book, this apocalypse, on the screen there, but less photogenically, we see in the names of the people, and I've circled them there, who owned it before, that there were people who had gained the wealth that they needed to acquire some, treasure of early printing through holding slaves, because they were among the people who were compensated when slaves were emancipated. And that's something that's, it's not really drawn out in that, but we can see the names and we can now do the research to find out who those people were.
So the next one that we have for you, and one of the things that Alex and I are trying to indicate to you is also how our report works, and that is that we've presented case studies, because we really believe in the idea of an aesthetic of fragments, and especially in the context of a history that has not been told from the perspective that we are trying to tell it from, these fragments become incredibly important. But unfortunately, one of the things that you'll notice in the context of the presentation and in general is at the end of the day, they are fragments. They're little bits that we hope researchers like yourselves, archivists like yourselves, and librarians like yourself will actually go on to dig deeper and much further, because you possess expertise in multiple areas that both of us clearly don't. Having given that caveat, let's actually look at one of the case studies that we have. You can read more about it online on one of the websites. This is the Safavid Quran. Some of you might have already seen it in the Gifts and Books exhibition that we had. It's very pretty to look at. It's very gorgeous. I also wash my hands the way you should wash before you touch a Quran. Yeah, and that becomes part of the tradition when it comes to artifacts. How do you deal with them? What are the cultures and traditions associated with them? But more than looking at the pretty bits, what I am perhaps most interested in is the pencil inscription on it, right at the back, which usually gets missed out when you're looking at something as pretty as this, right? And the inscription reads, for the University of Oxford, from Tipu's library, College of Lord William, presented by the Honourable, the Court of Directors for the Affairs of the Honourable, the East India Company Library, right? So you can see that becomes a very clear case of provenance, where this Quran actually comes from. And it is that at the end of the day, it was gifted to the University of Oxford, not necessarily the Bodleian, by the East India Company directors when the siege of Seringapatam happened in 1791. Many of you might be familiar with Tipu's tiger, and this is an extension of the exact same thing. One of my favorite things, especially as someone who has the privilege and honor of studying libraries, is the caption that came with that. And we have the book right here, but I'll read out the caption to you. So David Price was the captain responsible for cataloging the Qurans and the books at the time, right? And this is what he wrote about the books in Tipu's library, which at the time had gained fame because Tipu was an avid reader. Well, if not a reader, he was an avid collector. Many of us know that reading and collecting are very different hobbies when it comes to books, right? And Tipu would probably associate with it. But what I'm really interested in is what David said about it. David Price said about the Quran. He said, the library and depot of manuscripts was a dark room in the southeast angle of the upper veranda of interior quadrangle of the palace. Instead of being beautifully arranged, as in the Bodleian, the books were heaped together in hampers covered with leather to consult, which it was necessary to discharge the whole contents on the floor. Now, it's a gorgeous quote. What makes it even more important is that a man who is thousands of miles away from the Bodleian is thinking of the Bodleian, right? Except that's exactly what Alex and I are trying to talk about when we talk about the relationship between British Empire and the Bodleian libraries. Historically, that the Bodleian occupies popular imagination of the colonial officers who are going out there, which makes the responsibility of the Bodleian even more evident, that we've been setting standards for centuries that people have been following around the world, which also extends to the fact that colonialism is thus not just in terms of acquisition, plunder, but it's also in the mind, in the ideas. So if David Price is looking at a man who's collected thousands of books and then saying they're not on the shelves, so that clearly means inferior collecting practices, storage practices, that is something we as individuals working in a library that set the standards need to evaluate and think about, right? And those are the type of questions that we're trying to ask through the case studies that we presented, through the report we're assembling, so on. The next one is not such a pretty document. It is a folder that's dedicated to the erstwhile Indian Institute that used to sit in the Bodleian. I think it's becoming obvious I work on South Asia quite a bit. But yes, this one is titled The Battle of the Indian Institute because it's dedicated to the 1950s to the 1960s battle that went down. Often when people talk about the Indian Institute, which was founded in 1880 by Professor Monier Williams, professor for Sanskrit at the time, they usually do not, again, evaluate Bodleian's role in it. And one of the things is that Bodleian played a huge role because it was because of the texts and the manuscripts that we had been storing that a case was made that the Indian Institute should actually not go down. And you can find that in the letters in there, right? Except what also again becomes important are themes of acquisition, plunder, standardization, standards imposed by individuals. The man who founded the Indian Institute and thereby the Indian Institute Library, Professor Monier Williams, he once, when Max Muller wrote a text called Sacred Texts of the East, Professor Monier Williams responded by saying, there are no sacred texts except the Bible. Right? And this is the man who then went on to find the Indian Institute and who then also populated the majority of the Indian Institute Library, which Bodleian eventually inherited the text. What I'm saying is all these things become very evident in the context of our acquisition practices, collection cultures, standardization practices, cataloging, so on. It's not a very pretty file to look at as opposed to the Quran, but the more you read the letters, the more you're flabbergasted by the arguments people are giving, ideas people are upholding. Also, it becomes a case study in, when we're looking at colonialism, we're not just looking at individuals who are in power, British Empire and so on, but we're also looking at their relationship with the local elites. Because the Indian Institute was built on the money given by Indian elites, right? Multiple complex debates that colonialism brings to the table, but I'll let Alex carry on now. Yeah.
I think we've shown a lovely array of things. Do you want to say anything about the event tomorrow and how that fits in with the project?
Yes. So I suppose what we're talking to you almost becomes an alternate perspective to the archives many of you are very familiar with. And those are some of the ideas that we've tried to highlight when we work with researchers collaboratively during the project. So a lot of this is not our perspective, it's what individuals who worked with the archives beyond us, who are experts, have said. And Mischief in the Archives, or Mischief at the Bodleian, is one of those exhibitions, events, and so on. Peter found his family, like Alex said, in the Bodleian archives. His mother's freedom was negotiated here in Oxford, and the letter is downstairs in the exhibition. Tomorrow we have the Mischief at the Bodleian exhibition is ending this Sunday. So we're basically having a big celebration tomorrow where multiple people, including Peter, are coming down and we're going to celebrate the exhibit, ideas. But the whole point is to prompt more people, not just experts like yourselves, but the general audience to dig deeper in the Bodleian archives to potentially find their stories. It's a story about families that have not been heard often, but Peter also talks about the counter archive, which is stories that have historically not been highlighted in the archive. So his white great-great-great-grandfather, who was also an enslaver, he has multiple letters in the Bodleian, but his great-grandmother many times and his great-grandfather many times, who were black enslaved individuals, do not have any story per se. So what Peter does is, along with the Bodleian archives, he's bringing the archive in conversation with his own collection, a personal archive, almost a counter archive. And you can see the back and forth that they have between them. And you can see that in the exhibition, and you can see it physically tomorrow at the event from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. There will be singing in the Bodleian, yes. There will be dancing, chaos, and it's beautiful. The bookmarks become even more important because each of the bookmark carries a distinct story, a counter archive in its own right. So we have labeled it as gotta catch them all because each one tells a separate story, the grandmother, the grandfather, and Peter's own perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.